wrong by just giving me a list of 10 Republicans who owned slaves. But no one's able to do it, because there weren't 10. Someone thrashed around and told me that Grant inherited a slave, but this actually happened to be when Grant was a Democrat. So we don't need to argue over Grant, but my point is the fact that people have to fight at this level shows you that there is a stark overall truth to what I'm saying that is actually not known by even people who have a very good education and are completely immersed in American history and American politics. So after the Civil War, the Democratic Party was in ruins. And so it had to reconstitute itself. And so it built itself along a single major theme. And that theme is white supremacy. White supremacy was the governing doctrine of the Democratic Party in the post-war period. And this white supremacy is defined by the fact that the Democrats passed every segregation law in the South. Democratic governors signed it, and Democratic officials carried it out. And it was a delegate of the DNC, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who started the Ku Klux Klan. Now, interestingly, the Republicans shut down the Klan almost immediately with a series of acts called the Ku Klux Klan Acts of 1871. But the Klan was revived in the early 20th century when progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson showed a pro-Ku Klux Klan movie in the White House to the cabinet, no less. And this inspired a Klan revival not only in the South, but in the Midwest and the West. If one were to make a list of all the Grand Dragons and Grand Wizards and Kleagles of the Ku Klux Klan, 99% of them are Democrats. And virtually every American lynched by the Ku Klux Klan in the United States has been lynched by a Democrat. This is true. And then we fast forward a little bit to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which I thought was by and large done by the Democratic Party because, of course, it was Lyndon Johnson who is generally attributed to be the guy who pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1864. But what I didn't know was A, more Republicans proportionally voted not only for the Civil Rights Act of 64, but the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Fair Housing Bill of 68 than Democrats did. The main opposition to the civil rights movement came from the Democratic Party. If the Democratic Party was the only party in Congress, no Republicans, none of these laws would have passed. None of them. And so the question then becomes, what's going on? Why don't we all know all this? And when I would raise this issue with scholars, they would say, oh yes, Dinesh, well, now that you mention it, these things are true. But you need to know that there was a big switch. The two parties in the 1960s, on racial grounds, switched sides. It's kind of like saying that in the 1960s, the cops all became robbers and the robbers all became cops. Even if you didn't get the memo, that's supposedly what happened politically. I thought, well, that's implausible on the face of it, but is that really true? And the beauty of these kinds of claims, like the big switch, is they're very easy to check. Now, on the face of it, the big switch is supported by two pieces of data that are impossible to deny, nor would I try to. One, blacks who used to be Republicans are now today Democrats. Number two, white Republicans in the South, white Democrats in the South, many of them did move to the Republican Party and are Republicans today. So there actually has been this political migration. But this migration has nothing to do with race. If it did, you would expect that blacks would have become Democrats in the 1960s or in the post-1960s. But in fact, blacks became overwhelmingly Democrat in the 1930s. Now, in the 1930s, the Democratic Party was the party of segregation and the Ku Klux Klan. So for some reason, blacks left the party of Lincoln and emancipation, the party that had actually implemented the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Think of it, the right, not only freedom from slavery, but the right to vote and equal rights under the law. The whole civil rights movement was based upon these constitutional amendments, which, by the way, were not only passed by the Republican Party, They were passed by the Republican Party against virtually 100% Democratic opposition. For example, no Democrat voted for the 14th Amendment. No Democrat voted for the 15th Amendment. I'm talking about zero. So what we're talking about here is that you have this sort of Republican Party which had delivered for African Americans, and yet, why would they become Democrats and join, as I say, the party of segregation and the Klan? And the answer is the economic benefits of the New Deal at a very hard time in which survival itself was at stake. And when did white Democrats in the South become Republican? By and large, it was a trend that began in the 60s, but accelerated in the 70s, and really was consummated in the 80s, in the Reagan era. Now, most of you are too young to know the Reagan era, but Reagan's appeal was not to race. Reagan's appeal was to patriotism, it was to free markets, it was to privatization, deregulation, anti-communism. This was the agenda that pulled the South to the Republican Party. So what about Nixon's Southern strategy? There was no Southern strategy. In fact, Nixon didn't win the South. The Deep South went to Wallace, who was a Democrat, and was running as an independent. Nixon won the Upper South. Now, what I want to make is this. As the South became less racist, it became more Republican. You can almost draw those opposite lines through the 20th century to see this great shift in American history. Now, say what about women? The Democratic Party was the party of opposition to women's suffrage. It fought it for 30 years. It blocked it in the House and the Senate. Eventually, the Democrats were defeated in the Republican Congress. And so the Democrats fought it in the states, where they lost again. And so women's suffrage politically delivered by the Republican Party. Now, let's jump forward to today, because someone is going to say, well, wait a minute, what are you saying, Dinesh? Okay, the Democratic Party is the party of this history of bigotry. But what about now? Well, first of all, even if we were talking about now, we're in an academic setting. There would be no reasonable person in this room, I don't think, that wouldn't agree that the past has a decisive impact on the present, that present-day conditions are shaped by things that happened before. If the Democratic Party really is the party of slavery and segregation and anti-women's suffrage and the Ku Klux Klan and lynching and opposition to civil rights, wouldn't you expect some kind of public acceptance or admission of this? Interestingly, the Democratic Party has never admitted its role, it's never taken responsibility for it, it's never apologized for it, and it's never paid 1 penny in restitution for it. Never. In fact, in an unbelievable sleight of hand, the blame is always foisted onto someone else. In the case of the slavery, it was the South. The South is to blame. In the case of many of the other crimes of American history, it was the white man. It was America. America did this, America did that. Well, if America did it, presumably it would still be going on. Some Americans did it, and other Americans stopped them. So we need a somewhat more precise accounting of American political history. Now, I say all this because